Hi, and welcome to Feisty Mermaids. If you're joining us for the first time, this is the show where we explore the topics to help you unleash the power of the mermaid within. We talk about self love, relationships, and the roadblocks which often stop us from becoming limitless. In today's topic, we're going to talk about unsolicited advice. You know exactly what I'm talking about. It's that friend or family member that offers you advice and you haven't asked for their advice or counsel. I don't know about you, but that drives me absolutely bananas. We're going to explore this topic and I'll share with you some stories and the psychology behind it. This and more here on Feisty Mermaids. When I started this podcast, I was, of course, super excited. And I started to get messages from friends and family telling me that they were proud and thought that what I was doing was a really good thing. I felt empowered, I felt energized. And even though I was doing this for me, it was nice to get that encouragement. And then I got a message from an acquaintance on social media from someone that I really haven't spoken to in a very long time. And the message was critical about me posting about my podcast on my personal social media. And then this person also said, and I quote, "By the way, your music is cheesy as shit." Wow. I was so floored. I thought that was very bold and nasty and just downright rude. I knew there would be people who didn't care for my work, and I'm completely fine with that. I have a very niche podcast and blog, and the clothes that I design are, of course, very niche as well. So I knew that it wasn't bound to be everyone's cup of tea. So I thought about how I should respond to this, and as you can imagine, all kinds of really un-Buddha thoughts were going through my head. And I'll tell you about how I handled the situation towards the end of the podcast. But the situation really got me thinking about how many times people have given me unsolicited advice and how many times I've given unsolicited advice. I did some reading on the topic and I found some very interesting articles. In one article on Psychology Today, clinical psychologist Dr. Seth Meyers outlines why people give unsolicited advice. He observes that it's typically alpha type people who are most often advice givers, and he notes that they tend to have three qualities. The first one is that they're rigid in their approach to life. Number two, they have a grandiose sense of self. And number three, they lack awareness for their motivation for giving the advice. Well, based on what I remember from the person that offered me that unsolicited advice and sent me the message, I would definitely say that all three of those things apply. Now, let's face it. I think all of us from time to time have given unsolicited advice. And for the most part, people are well-intentioned and they're coming from a good place when they're trying to offer it. However, in another article that I read on verywellmind.com, the researchers point to a need for emotional validation and personal power as another reason people offer advice. They suggest that if someone engages in this type of behavior constantly, it actually may be a result of growing up in an environment where expressing their emotions was punished or ignored, leading to a need for that emotional validation. They may seek to deal with uncomfortable feelings through that external validation. So how do you deal with someone who is constantly offering advice without you asking? I would say boundaries are a really good place to start. We can probably do an entire podcast on boundaries and actually a series or a whole new podcast. But we're going to explore some concepts in future episodes. But I've learned that by setting boundaries with someone in a gentle way, it's really a healthy way to communicate that you didn't ask for their opinion and that you reach out if you decide that you actually do need it. So last summer, I had to pressure wash the driveway. And some of you may remember part of the story from podcast number 2, when I talked about kindness and how it ripples throughout the universe, really. So while I was pressure washing the driveway, there was a neighbor who stopped by several times to warn me about the dangers of using this machine. Of course, I live in Florida. It was in the middle of the summer. It's super hot. And I really took on the task without any protective kind of equipment. I was actually wearing a bathing suit and I was barefoot. So he constantly was offering me advice on proper footwear, and he shared stories about how people have ripped their toes off while using this kind of machine. And he also talked about other serious injuries. I knew he was coming from a good place. But after about the third or fourth time of unsolicited advice, I really started to get a little bit irritated. So I thanked him for his advice. And I told him that I would let him know if I needed some help to accomplish the task, and that I would seek his advice if I needed any additional safety tips. A gentle statement like that maintained a very civil conversation, and I didn't hold on to any resentment. If I would have taken his comments more personally and maybe put on my feminist hat, I would have created stories in my head about how maybe he thinks that women are incompetent or unable to do a quote-unquote man's job. By setting boundaries, you are in control. It was extremely insightful for me to read the book Boundaries: When to Say Yes, When to Say No to Take Control of Your Life by Henry Cloud and John Townsend. I'll put the link to the book on my blog. And I can tell you that it's really helped me to set very firm boundaries in so many areas of my life. It's also helped me to see the times when I was giving unsolicited advice. I didn't think I was guilty of it, but I really was. So now I make it a point to ask someone that I'm having a conversation with if they would be open to me giving advice or any guidance. And I'm also learning through boundaries that it's well within their right to refuse to hear any information I may have to share. And I don't dwell on it. After all, we all have a path. And honestly, most of us don't even take the advice that others give us, and we end up learning things the hard way. I've put this concept actually into practice in romantic relationships and also with my daughter. By asking them if they would welcome my advice, it helps to empower the other person versus me wanting to take control of the situation or wanting to fix a problem. It allows me to keep my ego in check and to examine the motivation behind offering what I think is great wisdom. I'll give you an example of this. A few months ago, a friend of mine was in the process of moving to a different city. Having relocated a few times in my life within the US and also to Europe, I've learned a thing or two about the subject. As an example, living in Florida, the tax structure is very different from other states within the US. Mainly because of the amount of tourism that we have, we actually don't have to pay a state tax. I think it may be a little bit different in Europe within each country, but nonetheless, taxes are a consideration you should always think about when you're moving anywhere. Anyway, I could tell that my friend had no clue about how expensive it was going to be moving to the new city, and in particular, the cost of living of going to a big city. I really wanted to take control of the conversation and run through a list of expenses he needed to be prepared for. And I kind of started to, but I quickly realized what I was doing. I was offering completely unsolicited advice. So instead, I asked my ego to take a break, and I held a conversation with my friend by asking a few curious questions instead. I said things like, "Oh, I don't know much about the city where you're moving. What's the tax structure like? Do they have a state tax?" To which he didn't have an answer. He didn't even know what a state tax was. So I smiled on the inside because I knew it wasn't my job to share information or to quickly do a Google search for him to show him a cost of living calculator. It simply wasn't my lesson. So how do you respond to a person? Or how did I respond? Let me go back to how did I respond to the person who sent me the unsolicited message about my podcast? Well, I actually opted not to engage. I wasn't avoiding him or running away. I simply determined that there are some people whose unsolicited advice I do want to hear. And anyone outside of that list is simply noise pollution. This person's opinion didn't matter. And quite honestly, I would not make a production decision for my show based on their comment. The fact is, there's a lot of things I'd love to upgrade about my show. And I'd love to hire a composer one day to create a unique intro. But for now, I am totally fine with my jingle. So I'd love to hear your stories of unsolicited advice. How are you drawing some boundaries around those? Or are you the one that's giving the advice that nobody wants to hear? Let me know. You can connect with me on social media. I'm on all the major platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, by looking me up at Feisty Mermaids. And also don't forget to visit and subscribe to my website for the latest blogs, podcasts, and clothes. And you can find it at feistymermaids.com. So for today, I will leave you with this quote. Sometimes the advice you give other people is the advice that you need to follow. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you next time.